graduating from high school and college with her AA degree at the end of June, and so to celebrate and to send her off to university, I wanted to make her a quilt to think of her family back at home. So I'm going to be making a quilt from this Sunday Best book, and it's by Sherry McConnell and Corey Yoder, and I'm going to be using a pattern in here called Starling. And so it calls for several fat quarters, and since her favorite colors are grays and blacks and pinks, and my daughters love pink as well, I thought this would be a good reminder of them when she's away. So I have several fat quarters here. I have my diagonal striped black and white binding, and then I'll be doing a pink backing. And so I can't wait to get started on this. I'll share my progress and some tips along the way. When a pattern requires you to cut hundreds of pieces from several strips, it helps to be as efficient as possible. And so what I like to do is keep my strips folded in half, so I have the selvage ends together on one side and then the fold on another, and I start by cutting from the selvage edges. I line them up on the folded edge first and then just kind of smooth them down the ends. It's important to remember that if you have, like I do right here, 3 folded strips, I'm really going to be cutting through 6 layers of fabric. So if you're not comfortable cutting through that many, then maybe use less. I think my blade will make it through. But what I'll do is take 3 at a time, and you can stack them one above the other, and again you just want to get the edges as aligned as possible. And I could probably fit another 1 or 2 with my ruler, but just for time's sake I'm going to demonstrate with these pieces here. Now, one other thing to mention is the selvage edges aren't always lined up perfectly end to end. Sometimes one half of the strip is up higher than the other. So when you're cutting off that first bit of the selvage, you want to take a generous cut to make sure you catch all the selvage edges. So let me scoot that down a bit so you can see. So I can see selvage edges here, and another one is here, and I want to go past the little dots that are in the fabric too. So I'm just going to make sure that my first cut is past those dots, my shortest edge here. And I like this ruler because I can align it to the bottom of the strip here to make sure that I'm all squared up. But I'm going to take that first cut and apply a lot of pressure on the ruler to keep the fabric from budging. I just make sure that went all the way through. Okay, and I'm going to make the next cut. Watch my finger, but hold it down. I'll do it again. Okay, so let's see what we've got here. I'm going to take all my selvage pieces off, and then I have 6 squares for every little pile I pick up. Oops, and that one didn't quite make it, so I'll go back and recut that. But I'll go all the way to the edge, and so then with the remaining piece of my strip, just want to again make sure they're lined up on this edge, not the folded, and I'm gonna keep cutting until I get close to the fold. Okay, and so I can see I won't quite have enough to make it to the edge there, so I'm going to take these ones, add them to my pile. So all I have left are these pieces, and these still have the fold in them. If I find I don't have enough with just the ends I cut, then I might iron these and go ahead and cut more from them. But I find that the patterns I use are pretty generous with their measurements, and there's usually a lot left over. So I'll save them just in case, but I have a feeling I'll have just enough. And so as you can see here, I'm well on my way to my 480 squares I need. quilt is made of 20 of the same blocks, and so to make a block you're going to need 2 different sizes of your color, and then 2 different size squares of your background fabric. So I just grabbed a stack of my whites here for the background, and then I'm going to pull 4 of these smaller squares out because they'll be used for something else later, and I don't want to accidentally use them up for this next part. So the first step is going to be to make a square and a square out of these pieces here. So I've got my smaller square and a square units all squared up. That's a lot of squares. And now I'm going to do the same thing with the larger squares and the larger background pieces. So we'll do the same thing where we just go one corner, opposite corner, and then press those seams open, and then do the same thing with the other diagonal. So I'm going to make more square and a square units, and this time there'll be 4 of them. My 4 larger square and a square units are finished, and so now I'm going to just square them up as well to the pattern size, and then I'll show you how to make the center. To make the center unit, you're going to need 4 of your smaller square and a square units, and so you're going to stitch the top row and the bottom row together first, a 1/4 inch seam, and because you have points on each side, what I like to do is just make sure that the points are aligned and touching first, and put a pin there first just to hold it in place. So with these points and sewing them together, pins are going to be really important. And then I just align the corners. So I'll do the same for this one. So again, just point to point. And this is a good time to remind you, if you have a directional print, just make sure it's going the way you want it, you know, up and down. Just check that out before you sew it together. I'm going to go ahead and sew across now. And as I get closer to the point going under the needle, I just want to watch the tip of it. I want my thread or the stitch line to just touch the tip of it. I don't want to cut off my point. So when you open it up, you should have the 2 points just touching. There shouldn't be a gap between them. And again, as you can see, if I can show you there, the stitch line just kind of kisses the top of the point on each side. So you just, again, want to make sure your line doesn't cut off the tip, otherwise you lose your point on the inside. Alright, so I pressed my seams, one's going to the left, one's going to the right. I made sure when I pressed it, first I did it with just the hot iron, and then I added some steam to really set it in. So now, because I've pressed the seams the opposite direction, I can nest the seams, and that's where I want to join them first with a pin. So just kind of move them together so they feel like they lock into place. And then I'm going to line up my points next. So again, I'm going to just look at where the tips meet and put a pin in there. And I like to, for the bottom one, because I don't want it to flip up on my, when it's going under the machine, I kind of pin it down. So I go a little diagonally along with the line of the diamond. And again, I'll do the same thing on this one. Just look in there and see where the points match up. And put a pin in there. And then I like to just stick one on the very end as well to keep the corners together. So with a block like this that involves so many points on both sides, I think pinning is really important. Alright, so I have the center of my block done now, and I'm just making sure, you know, all my points of the diamonds are touching and none of them are cut off. And then I am going to follow the directions in the pattern for this and press the seams open on this one, because they will be connected in a row with my larger square in a square, and so I want to be able to see the center of this block and be able to line it up with the point on the big square in a square. The next step is to make 4 block corner units that look like this. You're going to take one of your smaller square in a square and sew it to the white square, and then you'll sew these two together. Again, it tells you to press the seams open, but I'm going to press one seam to the left and one to the right to nest. But something that I did realize that might be worth noting, it says to make 4 of these units, and they're oriented like this, but one thing to keep in mind, if you have directional fabric, which I did in this block that I made earlier, is you do want to consider that they're not all going to be facing the same direction when they go into the block. So I had meant to make all of my stripes go vertically, and I hadn't considered that, so I have my, this was the original orientation, but then you do end up turning the block on each corner, so I do have 2 of them going horizontally. I decided to keep it this way because they're opposite or diagonal from each other. I thought it still looked balanced, but it is something to consider. If you have directional fabric, consider how you'll be turning those blocks, because the orientation will change. So the reason that I press toward the white side, because I know a lot of people will say, you know, press toward the darker print, is because I wanted to reduce bulk in the seam. There's already 2 layers of seams here, and so I didn't want to add a third, so I'm just again pressing it toward the white. And I've found that once the batting is behind the top, you know, you're not going to see the little 1/4 inch seam behind the fabric. I haven't had an issue with that anyway. So I'm going to nest my seams because I pressed them in the opposite direction. So I'm just gonna push to the left with my thumb and pull to the right with my index finger underneath till I feel them lock into place. And I'll put a pin there. And I find this part really enjoyable after doing so many points and trying to keep them lined up, that you just have to sew them to just a plain old square, no other points to line up. So I just keep the diamond on the top so I can make sure that I don't cut off the top. And again, we just want our stitch line to be right at the top, just touching the tip of the diamond. And I will just chain stitch the rest to send them through. So now when I open them again, I just want to check the tip of the one diamond that's in each block, make sure I didn't cut off the point. And I want to make sure that my seam's nested correctly and that there's just a straight line going down, so that one looks nice. Let's see these other ones here. That looks good. So again, straight line going down, point isn't cut off. That one looks good. That one looks good too. All right, I love when that happens. So now I'm going to press these, like I said, I'm gonna press this seam open so that way I can see the center and align it with the larger diamond in that square and a square unit. So let me go ahead and press those and I'll come back. Here's what the back of the block looks like when it's pressed open. So I like to hit it with some steam to really try and get it to lie flat. But you should have 4 of these corner units now. And now comes the fun part, putting the block together. So the way it'll look, and hopefully I'll have enough room here, here is the center. And you're going to put one of the large square in a square unit on each side, and one on the top and one on the bottom. Let's see if I can move that without knocking it over. There we go. And one on the bottom. And again, if you have directional fabric, you want to start paying close attention that it's going the right way. Maybe even mark it with a pen that erases with water, or a little piece of paper with a pin in it to remind you of the direction, or take a picture, whatever you need to do. But then you're going to put your corner units in so that the larger block is in the middle and the smaller diamond is in the outer corner, like so. Okay, and mine's hanging off the table a little bit here, but you can see what it's going to look like. And again, if you don't have a directional print like mine, it doesn't really matter which pieces you put, but you might just look for balance. You know, some of my pieces, like this one, doesn't have as much of the flowers happening in it, so you know, you might just check for balance and make sure that one isn't too heavy in the print. But I think this looks great. So what I'm going to do now is sew the center to the left piece, the center to the left piece, the center to the left piece, and I have some tips for lining up those points, especially this one where you're going to have a point on this side, and on this side you have 2 of them. So I'll show you how I manage that. Okay, so for the top row, I need to make sure that the top of my diamond here is centered with this seam. I want it going in the middle here, so that's why I didn't want to fold the seam to one side, but I just pressed it open so I can also see it on the back and see where the middle is. So what I'm going to do is just eyeball it at first and align the top edges. I'm going to want the diamond on the top so I can make sure I don't cut off my point when I send it through the machine. But you can poke the needle just above the diamond where you want the stitch line to be. And then when you go through the back, you can see I'm a little off there, so that tells me I need to move the bottom over just a hair, and I can kind of eyeball it and see the center there. So it's going, I don't know how focused that is, but it's going right through now, so that should be centered. And then I can just finish pinning. And this one just has the one seam to line up with, so the rest is really easy. So you'll do the same thing for the bottom row as well. Okay, so I'll send that through. Go slow. Make sure you don't cut off that tip. You can see it. Make sure my corners are aligned. Alright, so we'll check on that next, but I'm gonna chain stitch the other two together, and then we'll check and see that everything looks right. But I'm gonna go grab the middle section now. This is the most challenging one to put together, because just like the last one, you're going to have the center seam and the point to contend with, but you'll also have these 2 points to make sure it don't get cut off. Since there's 2 of them to watch, I like to put this one on top when it's going through the machine, but I'll show you the trick I use to make sure I don't cut off this one, since I can't quite see it. So I'm going to do the same thing I did before, where I'm going to try and line up the point of the diamond with the middle of the seam here. I want to line it up with the seam and keep my edges aligned. And then I'm going to stick the pin at the top of the point on the back side. I'm going to stick it through and make sure that it's also centered with the center of my pressed open seam here. So the pin's coming out. And then what I'm going to do is take an erasable pin. This just comes off with water, and I usually just use a little Q-tip so I don't get much water or have to worry about, you know, it shrinking before it's washed. So I'm just going to take the pen, the ink pen, and just make a little mark on the right and the left side of that pin that's sticking out. Okay, and that tells me where the tip of my diamond is. So then I can take this pin out. I pin from the top, and I'm gonna just hold it in place there. And then the rest, there's nothing to align to. I just, again, want to make sure I don't cut off the tips of the smaller diamonds. So just gonna pin it in place. Remember, pinning is your friend with this pattern. So I'm just gonna keep going with my chain stitching here. Okay, now as I get closer, let's see if I can show what's going on here. As I get closer, I just want to make sure that my blue line is going to be run over with the thread. So I'll take this pin out, and then I just want to make sure that I can see that blue line going through. Now I just have that last piece to do, which I'll do just like the first one that I sent through. Alright, so here are my 3 rows stitched together, and I'm going to stitch these 2 pieces together now. But before I do, I want to talk to you about pressing. So again, the pattern says to press the seams open, but for nesting purposes, I'm going to be pressing some toward the center and some seams away from the center and then toward again. Now, in the pattern there's a mix of colors. Mine are going to alternate. I have these light pinks and then I have different shades of grays all the way to black, and so I'm going to be alternating, you know, pink, gray. So mine do need to have a particular order. So my seams for the pink, I'm going to press like I just showed you. If I have a gray or black block, I'd be pressing in the opposite direction because I want those to nest with the opposite color when I put the whole quilt together. I'm ready to sew the top row to the middle row, and this will be very similar to when we were putting the thirds together. Because this one has 1, 2, 3, 4 points, and this one just has 1, I'm going to make sure this one's on top when it goes through the sewing machine so that I can see it. But again, the middle section is the one that we want to watch to make sure that we don't cut off that bottom point. I just realized I didn't hit record when I did my stitch down the long side here, but it is sewn together. I just removed the pins as I went, and when I open it up I can see again that my points and my seams are all aligned. Again, double check because it's easier to fix it before you start attaching the next rows. Or to another block. So now we're ready to do the bottom and attach it to the center. Alright, the points were all intact and my seams are aligned. So the last thing I'm going to do is just put a little T in the upper right corner to remind me that this is the top, and I'm doing it with this erasable marker. It comes off with water. But this will help me remember that I want to press the seams on my pink blocks down. And if I'm doing a gray or black block, I would press the seams up, again, to help them nest when it's time to put them all together. So I'm just going to press them down and that will complete the block. Here's the finished block. I just need to finish all 20 of them and then I'll show you how I put them together. So now comes the fun part, trying to figure out how to lay out these 20 blocks. And so this first configuration was just mixing the dark blacks and grays with the darker pinks and just making sure that they looked scattered around randomly. I didn't want too many close together. And so the other thing I was trying to keep in mind was some of these have polka dots and stripes, so I was trying not to put too many of those together. So what I think I'll do is I'll take a picture of this and then compare it to another layout. Here's a second option where the top left starts lighter and then I just arrange them so that the blocks gradually get darker as we move diagonally down, so that the darkest blocks are in the bottom right corner, or if she wants to flip it around then it could be the darks on top and lights on the bottom. But this one is more of kind of an ombre effect, transitioning from light to dark. Once I compare my photographs and decide which layout I like best, I'm going to be sewing these by row. So I'll start with the top row, and you might mark which one is on the left side or the right. And so each row together, and then you can connect the rows. Just make sure you watch those points as you put them together. You don't want to cut any of them off. So I'm going to decide which layout I like best and then sew the top together. After I sew my first 2 blocks of a row together, I mark the left block with the row tag, and then I just double check that all my points are intact and my seams are all lined up. I also look at those T's that I wrote at the top of the block, T for top, to make sure that they're all oriented the right way. So I use those as a guide as I put these blocks together. My 5 rows are stitched together. As you can see, I decided on the ombre look. I swapped a few blocks around just to really try and get all the lighter ones up in the corner and shift to what is clearly darker in the bottom right corner. And so now I'm going to stitch the rows together, and I still have my little labels on them to keep track of which one is which. When I press these, the pattern says to press the seams open. I'm gonna just press to one side. I just think it makes it easier to nest them, and I don't think it adds too much bulk. So I'm gonna press to one side. So you can choose either side. Just make sure, and for all the odd rows you press to one direction, and the even rows you press to the opposite direction, and that will help them sew easily together. Almost to the end. Just made it. The top is all stitched together now, and I'm going to prep it for the long arm tomorrow, which I've already made a video about prepping the batting and the backing, and just making sure that the top is all ironed, which this one is. So I'll take it to the long arm and show you the final product. I finished my cousin's quilt using the Starling pattern by Corey Yoder, which is found in the book Sunday Best Quilts, 12 Must-Make Quilts You'll Love Forever by Corey Yoder and Sherry McConnell. And this quilt finishes at 60.5 by 75.5 inches. I ended up using a black and white diagonally striped binding, and I just think it frames it really well and ties everything in nice. It really, when the binding came on, that's when I felt like, oh my gosh, I really like this quilt. I used a quilting design on here on the long arm machine called Repeat Geometric Diamonds, and so when I get up closer here, you'll see it just has different shaped diamonds all throughout. So I just thought it looked nice with the multiple diamonds throughout this quilt without taking away from the blocks. So I have white thread on the top, and then the back has a light pink to match the backing of this quilt. One of the things I really appreciate about this quilt is the secondary shapes that come out of it when you put it all together that you don't necessarily see when you are just putting together the individual 15-inch blocks. So aside from the main block here that's in the colored fabric, you also see these white stars all throughout. And then there's also, when 4 blocks come together, you get this kind of pointed cross shape, and then it has 4 different fabric diamonds in the middle of it. And so it really does just have a bunch of different shapes coming in and out, and my eye is just kind of drawn to something new each time. So Yeah, really beautiful, and one of the most challenging quilts I've done to date just because of all the points, especially on the edges, getting the binding on without a piece of border. It was trickier to get the points and the binding on and not cut those off. So it's definitely one of those, just go slow and check as you go, check frequently as you're sewing the binding on, but really worth it and worth the time and effort. I hope my cousin loves this as much as I do, because it is definitely a beauty. So I'm going to pop it in the washing machine, and then I will show you how I'll wrap it up to give to her, and I'll also zoom in to show you the back and the quilting up close. Here's that diamond design that's throughout, and the way they connect, they actually end up making larger diamond shapes all throughout, so it really complements the diamond shapes in the block. Here's the backing, a really soft blushy pink with off-white florals throughout. You can see that diamond shape just has the light pink thread on the back, and then it looks really nice with the black and white striped binding. And there's that label again with the little border, which I'll show you how I put on in another video just to give it a little extra something and tie into one of the blocks that's on her quilt. And I put the Quilting Tale care label on there, and again I'll have a video showing how I attach these labels, but it just has the care instructions for how to wash it, which is what I'm going to do next. This Starling quilt is all rolled and wrapped and ready to give to my cousin. I'm excited about showing it to her. I made a separate video on how to roll the quilt like this to give as a gift, with some tips on how you might present it. I also have another video I filmed along the way with how to make this label and attach other kinds of labels, and there's another video about how I wash my quilts and just recommendations for different products that I've had a lot of success with. So look for those, and if you like this video and want to help me grow this YouTube channel, please remember to like and subscribe, and I appreciate you watching. See you next time.